Hi Minerva makers, my name is Melanie and this is my first sewing tutorial video with Minerva. Join me today in a sew-along of Butterick 4790. We'll be learning how to sew darts, how to sew bias binding, and how to hem a circle skirt. This is a wrap dress with a circle overskirt. It is super flattering and easy to wear. You can get creative and use different fabric colors for the front and back pieces or contrasting bias binding. I hope you'll give this tutorial a try for yourself. Let's get started. Today we'll be sewing Butterick 4790 in view B. This pattern comes in sizes 8 to 22. To choose your size for this pattern, refer to the tab on the top. Choose your size based on your bust and waist measurement. The skirt is free, so you don't have to worry about your hip measurement. The fabric I used for this dress is a pure cotton poplin with a gorgeous rose print. This is a really easy fabric to work with as it is light and free-feeling. You need to use between 3.5 to 4 meters depending on your size. Check the back of the pattern for the recommended amount for your size and the width of your fabric. Before you use the fabric, you need to pre-wash it. I suggest soaking it to remove excess dye, then giving it a wash on the delicate cycle with your washing machine. Hang it out to dry, then iron it on the cotton setting. Other haberdashery that you will need includes 3 packs of bias binding with a width of 2.5 centimeters for a single fold or 1.25 centimeters for a double fold. For decoration, you'll need 3 buttons about 1.5 centimeters in diameter. You'll need 1 large button which is about 2.2 centimeters in diameter. You'll need 3 sets of snaps about 1 centimeter in size. You will also need 1 reel of thread in a matching color. I'd recommend getting 2 just in case. I've linked this fabric and haberdashery in the description of this video so you can make this dress for yourself. For your sewing equipment, you will need the following: a sewing machine, pins, fabric scissors and paper scissors. In case you make a mistake, you'll need a quick unpick. You'll need a tape measure, tailor's chalk or an erasable fabric marker. To mark the darts, I'm using a tracing wheel and carbon paper. For the needles, I recommend using a universal size 80, which is suitable for cottons. You also need regular sewing needles for a few touch-ups. Optional extra is an overlocker with matching thread to make a clean edge. Also, a dress form with a hem gauge goes a long way for hemming the dress. You can also find this equipment with Minerva. I suggest signing up for the Minerva Craft Club to get 10% off. It will really help if you need to buy high quality equipment. Take out your pattern. To cut out the pattern, you need to follow the line for your size around the outside of the pattern. To make it easier to follow, you can draw on top of the pattern with a marker. You can change the size of your waist by drawing a line from your bust size to your waist size above the marked waistline. Create a smooth line. You would also need to cut the skirt piece with the same size as the waist. Make sure that you don't cut into the darts on piece 1 and 2. These are the triangles on the inside of the pattern. I've cut my pattern out in size 12. This pattern has only 3 pieces. The instructions for this pattern have a recommended cutting layout. I recommend following this layout to save fabric. I'm using the second layout as my fabric is wide. The first diagram shows that the fabric needs to be folded in half. So I'm going to bring the selvages together on my fabric and fold in half widthwise. I'm then going to pin the selvages together. Smooth out the fabric. The shaded pieces on the diagram means that the piece needs to be placed upside down. Place piece 1 on the fabric upside down. This piece has a rectangle arrow on one of the edges, which means that it needs to be cut on the fold. Bring this piece up to the fold of the fabric and place it on top. Pin to the fabric. We must not cut on this side of the pattern to make a symmetrical piece. Pin the rest of the piece to the fabric. Cut around the outside of the piece close to the edge. The small triangles at the edge of the pattern are called notches and they help us align the seams. To make these markings, you can cut into the triangle. Take out the pins and spread the fabric on the table as a single layer. Take piece 3 and place it upside down on the fabric so that the straight edge is close to the selvage. This piece has a grain line arrow which we must line up with the grain of the fabric. Measure from the grain line arrow to the selvage of the fabric. Make sure that the pattern has the same distance down the length of the grain line. Pin the entire pattern. Cut the pattern out. Remember to cut the notches. On the other side of the selvage, place piece 3 again, this time facing right side up. Pin and cut this piece again. Lastly, piece 2 needs to be cut on the fold. Fold over enough of the fabric so you can place piece 2 on top. Measure the length from the selvage to the fold, making sure there is the same distance for the space that you need to cut. Place piece 2 on top. Pin the side of the pattern with a fold marking to the fold. Pin and cut the rest of the pattern. Before I start sewing, I like to mark all the important guide markings. We need to mark the circle marking at the bottom of this piece on the right side of the fabric. Pin the pattern to the fabric. Push a needle into the fabric at the center of the marking through 2 layers of the fabric. Pull back the pattern, but keep the pin in place. Make a marking where the pin is. Carefully flip the fabric over and make the marking at the base of the pin. You can also mark the 3 circle markings at the center front, but I found that this is covered by bias binding later. Use this method to mark the dot on the small curved edge of piece 3. Mark the 2 copies of the fabric individually. To mark the darts, I'm using a tracing wheel and carbon paper. Grab piece 2 and unfold this piece. Place it on the table with the right side facing up. Place the pattern on one side of the fabric and pin around the dart. Unfold your carbon paper and place it underneath the fabric. The coloured side of the carbon paper must be facing up. With your tracing wheel, roll over the top of the dart line. Press firmly. Unpin the pattern. Flip it over and place it on the other side of the piece. Trace the dart line again. On the wrong side of the fabric, you'll have a perfect line to represent the dart. Repeat this method to trace all 6 darts on piece 1. To sew the dart, we need to pin so that the 2 lines are together. Take your pin and push it through one line of the dart and out the other. The pin needs to be horizontal. Place the pins down the length of the dart. I can now fold the dart in half and push in the pins. I'm now going to pin across the entire dart. Repeat for the other dart on this piece. Pin together the topmost darts for piece 1 for now. All of the darts we have pinned have a base at the seam. Here's how to sew them. Bring the dart to your sewing machine. Start sewing from the base of the dart directly on top of the carbon paper marking. Sew to the tip of the dart. As you approach, sew on top of the fold for a few stitches. You may need to change your angle slightly. Do not backstitch. Lift the foot up and pull the fabric from the machine and cut the thread with a long tail. Repeat this for all of the darts that you've pinned. Moving on to the vertical darts on piece 1. Pin all 4 of these darts just the same as the previous one. These darts are special in that they have 2 tips. Before you start sewing, pull some thread out the machine to make a long tail. Bring the tip of the dart up to your machine. Start sewing on the fold for a few stitches. Do not backstitch. Keep sewing up to the marking that you transferred for the dart. Near the other tip of the dart, sew on top of the fold for a few stitches, and don't backstitch. Pull the fabric out of the machine and cut a long tail. For the tip of each dart, you will need to hand knot the leftover threads together. I'm using a basic square knot to do this. Cut the excess thread off. The last thing we need to do for these darts is to iron them. Bring the bodice pieces up to the ironing board. Iron the dart flat, but don't iron beyond the tip of the dart. Do this for both of the darts on piece 2. Spread out the piece. This dart needs to be folded towards the center. Use your iron to press the dart towards the center of the piece. On the right side, the pieces should be smooth. Iron the darts on piece 1 as well. The horizontal darts need to be ironed down, and the vertical darts need to be ironed towards the center of this piece. The darts are all ready. Let's move on to sewing the pieces together. We now need to sew the skirt pieces together at the center back. This seam is marked by the 3 notches. Place these pieces right sides together at the center back seam and match the triple notch. Pin together. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Finish the raw edge with your overlocker or sew over the top with a zigzag stitch. Take your skirt over to the iron and press the seams split. For the next step, we need to stay stitch the top of the skirt. Sew it about 1.3 centimeters around the top edge. We do this to stabilize the seam. With your shears, create slits in the fabric up to the stitching that you just made. This will help release the tension on the waist seam. We can now sew the skirt to piece 2. Place piece 2 on top of the skirt with the right sides together. Both piece 2 and the skirt have 2 dot markings that need to be aligned for the waist seam. I suggest stacking the 2 dot markings on top of a pin. Pin around these dots. Pin piece 2 to the skirt. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Now sew this seam again at about 1.3 centimeters. The second seam is the reinforcing seam to help prevent stretching. Carefully trim the seam allowance to about half and finish the seam allowance with your overlocker. Next, we'll sew the shoulder seams of the dress. Grab piece 1 and lay it face up. Place the back piece that you've sewn on top with the right sides together. At the shoulder edges, make sure that the notches are together. Pin these pieces together. Sew the 2 shoulder seams together at 1.5 centimeters. Finish the raw edges. Bring the dress over to the ironing board. Iron the seam allowance for the waist up. Iron the shoulder seam split apart. Let's move on to sewing the hems. We need to hem the circular overskirt and the bottom of piece 1. Before we can make the hem, we need to hang the dress. The bias or diagonal of the fabric will stretch over time, so we need to hang the dress for 24 hours to allow this. You can hang it on a coat hanger or a dress form. Next, we need to measure how much the bias has stretched. For the best results, you need a dress form. Pin the dress on and make sure that the waist seam is straight. Start at the center back of the skirt and adjust the hem gauge to the height of the skirt. I'm adjusting the gauge so that the raw edge will run through the notch at the top. Move the skirt through the hem gauge and turn the dress form. If the skirt drops lower than the gauge, then place a pin. This means that the bias has fallen and needs to be cut off. Work your way around the circle hem. Grab some scissors. Cut the new hem by following the pins. Change your stitch length to the maximum on the straight stitch and use a contrasting thread colour. Pull some thread out of your machine. Sew along the bottom of the circle skirt at 1 cm. Do not backstitch before or after you sew. Pull the fabric out of the machine and cut a long tail. Bring your skirt up to the ironing board. Start with the straight hem on the front first. Fold up the raw edge by 3.2 cm on the wrong side. Press with an iron. Fold under about half of the raw edge. Pin into place. Now for the circular hem. You may need to pull one of the long threads that you made to tense up the fabric of the hem. This helps make the hem nice and flat when it's sewn. Fold over the raw edge by 1.5 cm on the wrong side and press. Fold under about half of the hem to make a clean edge and pin. Check that the hem doesn't have tucks. Back at the sewing machine, sew on top of the fold for both of the hems. We have a lot of raw edges left on this dress, so I'm going to finish them with bias binding. My bias binding is single fold, which is okay. You can fold the bias binding in half and press it to use for this dress. Use the wool setting at most. Ideally, one side of the bias binding should be just a few millimeters longer than the other. Use the longer side on the wrong side of the dress. The wider side of the bias binding should be on top of the inside of the dress so it's caught in the seam when you sew. Firstly, we will bind the neckline. Bring the binding up to the raw edge. Press the raw edge inside of the binding near the shoulder seam. The end of the binding should be above the shoulder seam. Pin into place. Put the bias binding all the way around the neckline. When you reach where you started, cut the bias binding about 0.5 centimeter further than the shoulder seam. With your iron, fold away that 0.5 centimeter extra on the wrong side. Use this fold and pull it over the other raw edge of the binding. It should line up with the shoulder seam. Pin it into place. Sew on top of the bias binding close to the edge. Next, we'll bind the side seams. Pin the binding to the side of the dress. The top of the side seam should be cut flush with the fabric. Cut about 0.5 centimeter excess at the hem of the dress. Press up the binding by 0.5 centimeter and bring it in line with the hem and pin. Sew on top of the bias binding. Do this for all 4 of the side edges. Lastly, we will bind the armholes of the dress. On the left side of the dress, pin the binding over the raw edge, including over the top of the binding you previously sewn. Leave about 0.5 centimeter excess to fold away the raw edge. On the right hand side of the dress, on the front piece, we need to leave 7.5 centimeters excess binding at the centre back corner. Measure this with your tape measure and mark. Pin the corner under this marking. At the other end of the armhole, leave about 0.5 centimeter excess. Use the iron to press the excess binding on all of the armhole pieces. Place this flush with the corners and pin. Sew the binding to the dress. Continue sewing over the excess binding which will be used for the loop. Here's how to make the loop. At about halfway point, fold the binding down on the wrong side, then fold it back towards the dress. On the wrong side of the dress, fold the raw edge of the binding away. You should be able to pass the button through the loop. Sew back and forth over the top of the binding in 2 rows. The button for the loop that we just made needs to be sewn on the opposite corner of piece 1. Grab a needle and thread it with a double-stranded knot. Push the needle through the wrong side of the dress and up through the hole in the button. Pull the thread through and push the needle through the other side of the button. Hover the button about 3 mm over the top of the fabric. Keep pushing the needle through the fabric and the button to create a nice stack of threads. Now we need to create a shank. Loop the needle around the button and pass it through the loop. Pull the loop down. Repeat this around 4 times to bind the threads. Push the needle through the wrong side and knot off. Create a small stitch in the fabric to create a loop. Pass the needle through the loop 3 times. When you pull the thread, a knot will form at the base. Repeat once and cut off the excess thread. To close this dress, we need to use snaps. On the left side of piece 2, I'm going to place the snap with the socket. I'm placing 1 snap at each corner of piece 2 and the last directly in the center. The snap needs to be close to the edge and on the wrong side of the fabric. Use some tailor's chalk to mark where the snap needs to be sewn. Push the needle through the other side of the snap and out through the hole. Push the needle through the hole beside it. Repeat this pattern until you've built up some thread on this side. Make a stitch into the other set of holes and build up thread on this side as well. Once you're done, knot off. Repeat this for all 3 of the snaps. On the other side of piece 2, we need to sew the post half of the snap on the right side of the dress. Place the snap in the same position as previously and make a marking. Sew the snap into place just the same as the others. On the front of the dress, we can now sew on the decorative buttons. These buttons need to be placed on the right side and above the snaps. They should cover the stitching that you made. Sew these buttons straight onto the fabric. They don't need a shank. Lastly, we need to sew the bias binding on the neckline shut. Thread the needle and push it through the wrong side of the bias binding. Make small horizontal stitches over the top of the binding until you reach the wrong side of the dress. Knot off. And that's it. This super flattering and beautiful dress is ready to wear. Today we learned how to sew a Butterick 1950s vintage dress. I hope you'll give this pattern a try for yourself. I'd love to see your gorgeous interpretation. Please follow Minerva for more inspirations, projects and sewing tutorials. Leave a comment below. We'll be sure to read it. Thanks for watching.